My policeman nephew came home for a few days, and I couldn't resist. I couldn't help myself around him. My name is Zoe, and the life I lead has never been exactly ordinary. Married to Balthazar, a truck driver who spends more time on the road than at home, I've become accustomed to loneliness. Not that it was a choice, but time ended up shaping me. I always knew that his work was our reality, a reality that I accepted, but which, over time, left its mark. Balthazar and I were more companions than lovers, more partners than lovers. His and my marriage was, for the most part, a silent coexistence, sandwiched between his travels and my solitary routines. The house, too big for just one person, seemed even emptier when he left. As well as his absence, there was also the weight of the distance that seemed to grow with each trip. Balthazar rarely stayed at home for more than 2 or 3 days, and on the other days, I managed as best I could. Alone, without children, but with a life that already seemed tired. When he left, I stayed at home, taking care of the daily chores, our property, and myself as far as possible. I did my best to maintain normality, but a part of me knew that something inside me was changing, something I couldn't control. But that day, everything was about to change, not because of him, but because of Alexander. It was a hot July morning. I was in the kitchen, stirring the pot of coffee while looking out of the window, trying to imagine how far away Balthazar must be by now. The distant sound of the truck's engine echoed along the road that passed right in front of our house. He had left in the morning, and now, as always, the house was empty. There was absolute silence, broken only by the sound of the wind shaking the trees and the rustling of dry leaves. Then I heard the sound of an engine coming from the road. It wasn't Balthazar's snoring. I looked up and saw a motorcycle approaching. My mind immediately recognized the silhouette, the haircut, and, above all, the imposing manner of someone who was used to carrying a heavier burden than most people could. He was back, Alexander, Balthazar's nephew. When I last saw him, he was just a mischievous boy, full of dreams and a desire to travel the world. But now, he looked like a grown man. His shoulders were broad. His eyes were heavy with the weight of his army experiences. He had the manner of someone who had seen the worst of life, and who, somewhere inside him, held an imperturbable calm. But there was something else, something I couldn't immediately identify, but which I felt deep in my soul. He was no longer the same. When he stopped the bike and took off his helmet, the wind ruffled his dark hair, and he smiled, as he always did, with that self-assured, unhurried, unpressured expression. "Hi, Aunt Zoe." His voice was deeper than I remembered, but it still carried that friendly, relaxed tone that made me smile. "Hi, Alexander," I replied, trying to disguise the discomfort that was taking hold of me. I shook his hands as he approached, and his touch took me by surprise. There was something about his hands that sent a shiver down my spine. Something firm, too strong for someone so young. He had changed, and I was trying to understand how that had happened. "How are you?" he asked, still smiling, but his eyes kept watching me with a curious glint, as if he was trying to understand me. I don't know if it was the way he looked at me or the fact that he was so close, but I began to feel uncomfortable. He seemed to want to know more about me, not just as his aunt, but as a woman, something that deeply disconcerted me. "I'm fine, you know. The house, the same as always," I replied, looking away, trying not to let him see how uneasy I was. "And you? How was it in the army?" "It was intense," he said, and for the first time I noticed the seriousness in his voice. The look he gave me wasn't that of a boy, but of a man who had a lot to say but didn't know where to start. He looked down at his hands, palms open, as if he was still trying to remember who he was after what he'd been through. "I saw things, Auntie. Things that change you. But I'm trying to find myself again. I just needed some time, you know?" He sat down on the sofa, which seemed small for his size now. I felt strange, as if I had lost control of something that should be simple. A visit from a nephew, but something about the way he settled there, as if at ease, didn't make me feel that it was all so simple. I knew he was looking for something, perhaps a purpose. perhaps a way to rediscover himself after so much pressure. "I understand," I replied, trying to be courteous, but my words sounded empty, because I didn't understand. I couldn't understand that man there, or the uncomfortable feeling he was causing me. I should have been happy to have him home, but something inside me, something subtle, was telling me to keep my distance. But why? He was so close to me, yet so far away. "I'm going to go upstairs and leave things in my room," he said, getting up from the sofa with a natural movement. "Where do you think I can keep my things?" "Sure, I'll show you," I replied, still unsure of how to act. The feeling that something was about to happen was growing inside me, but I didn't know what. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the house as I led him into the guest room. The house, although large and well lit, seemed to be closing in, as if we were in a different, more intimate setting, where I could no longer hide from my own reactions. The smell of coffee still hung in the air when I returned to the kitchen, trying to put my mind in order. The hours passed more quickly than I had imagined, and soon lunch was ready. The wind outside continued to sway the trees, but now there was a feeling of unease in the room, as if Alexander's presence was stirring something inside me. He came down to the kitchen with a calm countenance, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to be watching me in a way that I couldn't explain. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat at the table, watching me with the same intensity as before. I tried to keep the conversation light, talking about things around the house, but the tension in the air was palpable. I didn't know what he was expecting from me, nor did I know what I wanted back. "Do you still like gardening?" he asked, looking out of the window at the garden I used to tend in the few moments I wasn't busy with housework. He had always known that I loved being in the garden, looking after the flowers and plants that I had planted myself. But why the question now? "Yes," I replied, trying to look away. "I still look after the garden. I need something to do to pass the time." He stood up slowly, as if he was plucking up the courage to say something, but instead he came to the window and stood next to me, too close. I could almost feel his body heat. What did he want, anyway? Why did everything seem so different? I was supposed to be the aunt, the responsible one, but he was challenging me in a way I didn't know how to handle. "I know you feel lonely, Zoe," he said suddenly, in a low, almost secretive tone. "And it's not wrong, I understand. Loneliness is something you can't avoid sometimes." I remained silent. My heart beat faster. He knew more than he should have. I tried to ignore the feeling of being exposed, but it was impossible. Alexander was getting closer in a way that I wasn't ready to handle, and at that moment, something inside me finally gave way. Something I'd been trying to hide from everyone, even myself. Something that I knew could change everything. The days following Alexander's arrival passed more quickly than I'd like to admit. Something about his presence in the house seemed to have changed the air around me. At first, I thought it was just the effect of having him back after so long, but I soon realized that there was something more, something I couldn't control. His every gesture, his every word, seemed charged with a strange tension, as if he was watching me with a different look, a look I didn't know how to interpret. I used to go out for a walk in the garden on the mornings when Balthazar wasn't there, but on those days, the simple act of leaving the house seemed more difficult. I felt watched, and not just by a nephew, but by someone who seemed to see more in me than I would have liked. Alexander was constantly in my presence, whether at breakfast, lunch, or in the late afternoon when he came down to talk, always in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was a hot Thursday, and the heat seemed heavy in the air. The house, which had always been cool before, now seemed stifling. I was in the kitchen, stirring some herbs that I was going to use for dinner, when I heard the familiar sound of a motorcycle engine. Alexander's bike was parked in the garage, but he soon appeared at the kitchen door. "Are you busy?" he asked, with a calm expression, but with something in his eyes that seemed to carry an expectation. I knew what he wanted, but I didn't know how to react. He was testing me, and I didn't know how far that could go. "Not far," I replied, trying to remain calm. "What happened?" He smiled in a way that, for some reason, sent a shiver down my spine. "I was thinking of taking a little trip around the area. You don't have anything against it, do you?" The question was light, but the way he looked at me made the simple suggestion sound like a proposal. "A trip? But it doesn't make sense right now. Why not get some rest since you're at home?" I knew that what I was saying had nothing to do with how I really felt. The truth was that, with him at home, I didn't want him to go. I wanted somehow to maintain that closeness, but I didn't know why. "I've already spent so much time on assignment. I think I can get away for a while. I need to disconnect from everything for a while," he replied, his voice low but filled with a sincerity that disconcerted me. Something about the way he spoke made me feel that he wasn't just looking for a physical break, but something more. And somehow, I felt guilty for not being able to offer him what he was looking for. "Well, if you think you need it." I left the sentence hanging in the air, not wanting to say more. But the truth was that I didn't want him to go. I wanted to be near him. I wanted him to be there. But I didn't know what to do with these feelings that were building up inside me, like a storm that I couldn't control. He walked away to get the bike key and, before leaving, he stopped at the kitchen door and looked at me with an intensity that made me stop breathing for a moment. "Zoe, are you all right?" he asked, as if he already knew the answer. "I feel like you're distancing yourself. And I don't want that to happen." His words hit me like a punch in the gut. It wasn't just a simple question, it was a silent demand, as if he knew what I was trying to hide from myself. I didn't know what to say. I looked at him, trying to find the right words, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. I was distancing myself, but not because I didn't like him, but because I felt lost. I was starting to see Alexander in a different way, and it was scaring me. "I'm not distancing myself," I finally said, my voice low. "I just need a little time." He smiled, but not as lightly as before. His smile now seemed deeper, more charged with something I couldn't understand. "I understand," he said, before turning his back and walking out the door. The day passed slowly. I found myself constantly remembering those words, Alexander's smile, the way he looked at me before he left. What was happening to me? Why did I feel so unsettled? I knew I was indulging in something I shouldn't, but at the same time, I couldn't stop. Something in me was screaming at me to stay away. But with every look from him, every word exchanged, I found myself getting closer and closer to falling into something I didn't know how to control. That night, after dinner, Alexander sat at the table, once again too close. I felt his presence as if he were in every corner of the room, and it was impossible to ignore him. The conversation flowed naturally, but there was something in the air, something that weighed on me. I didn't know what to make of the growing tension between us, but it was there, as real as the sound of the clock on the wall. "You haven't been talking much, Auntie," he said, with a smile that somehow didn't sound as friendly as it used to. "Something seems to be weighing you down." "I've just been tired, I guess," I said, trying to sound casual. But I knew I couldn't hide what was going on inside me. The words were piling up, but I kept them stuck in my throat, afraid to release them, afraid of what it might mean. He leaned forward a little, coming closer, as if trying to understand every nuance of my expression. "You're not alone, you know. I'm here, Auntie. No matter what happens. Sometimes things are easier when you have someone to count on." I looked at him, and the warmth in his gaze made me feel like I was being stripped naked. It wasn't the look of a nephew, but of someone who wanted more from me. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know if I was being silly, if I was imagining things, or if there was something real going on between the two of us. The tension was growing by the second. He was closer to me than I wanted, and I couldn't push him away. Words began to form in my mind, but I couldn't say them. The mere idea of making any move felt almost like a betrayal that didn't involve Balthazar, but something much deeper. "Zoe," he said, his voice lower now. "I know what's going on. You don't have to say anything. I know what you're feeling." I looked at him, feeling the weight of his words in my mind. I didn't know what was going on, but at that moment, something inside me snapped. I was no longer just aware of the tension between us. I was beginning to accept, somehow, that there was something more there, something that couldn't be ignored. The night passed without me saying another word, but the unspoken words hung in the air, weighing on me, like a secret shared but not confessed. I was beginning to realize that I could no longer go back. The days that followed that night seemed to drag by, as if time had slowed down. But at the same time, everything was happening so fast. The house, which used to be a quiet and stable refuge, now seemed to be full of presences, even when no one was around. Alexander's presence hung in the air, always around me, and there was no escaping it. Balthazar was still far away, on some unknown road, and I didn't know if I felt relief at his absence or if the feeling of being too alone made me more vulnerable. Alexander had already settled in comfortably at my house, and I could tell he was in no hurry to leave. He was no longer just there as a nephew. He was becoming a constant presence, like a silent shadow following me around, and there was no longer any way of ignoring what was happening. It was a Friday morning, hot and muggy. The house was silent, except for the sounds of the wind coming through the open windows. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the door to the living room opened, and I heard the familiar sound of Alexander's footsteps. He was waking up earlier than usual, and that somehow disconcerted me. I knew he had his own routines, but when he appeared, it seemed that the air around me became denser. "Good morning, Aunt Zoe," he said, in that deep, almost sleepy voice, but charged with an energy I didn't know how to handle. He approached the bench where I was standing, and the smell of coffee mingled with the woody scent he exuded. "Good morning, Alexander," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, but the tension growing inside me was inescapable. I knew that something was about to happen between us, and somehow I didn't want it to, but with every look from him, every enigmatic smile, I felt I had no control over my own feelings. "I was thinking," he said, taking a cup of coffee and sitting down at the table. "You don't have anything else to do today, do you? I wanted to enjoy the day, maybe go out for a bit, take a walk in the city." I hesitated for a moment. Something in his tone seemed charged with an intention that I didn't know how to identify. Maybe it was just my paranoia, but I felt like he was testing me, as if it were a way of bringing us even closer together, something I couldn't refuse. "I can accompany you, if you like," I said, trying to sound casual, as if the idea of spending more time with him was something normal. He looked me straight in the eye, and I saw something in his eyes that made me hold my breath. "I'd love to, Auntie. I think it would be nice to spend the day with you. Just the two of us to talk." "Yes, of course," I replied with a nervous smile. I didn't know what he wanted, but something told me that this wasn't just going to be a simple walk. We left the house after a few minutes. I felt strange, like I was doing something wrong, although I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The town, which had seemed small and quiet before, now seemed like an open landscape, as if it was waiting for something to happen. Alexander's steps beside me were firm, sure, and I felt increasingly out of place, as if he were leading me down a path I didn't want to be part of. We walked through the silent streets, exchanging occasional words about trivialities, the weather, the city, the people. But there was something underlying these words. I felt that he was probing me, trying to understand me more than I understood myself at that moment. And I knew that, at some point, the words would be put aside, and what really mattered would begin to emerge. "The city is quieter than I remember," Alexander said, looking around with a pensive gaze. When I was younger, it seemed more alive, full of life. Now, everything seems more still. I looked at him, trying to understand what he meant by that. Time passes, things change, I replied, trying not to let the conversation stray into something more personal. But, as was always the case, words weren't enough to hide what was happening between us. He stopped suddenly, making me stop too. "Zoe," he said, his voice soft but loaded with something I couldn't identify. He moved closer to me, closer than I expected, and the distance between us seemed to disappear at once. "I know what's going on. I know you feel what I feel. There's no point pretending it's not happening, because I can see it in your eyes." I felt my heart beat faster. "You don't know what you're saying," I said, trying to take a step back. But he was quick. His eyes were fixed on mine, and I couldn't look away. "There's no point in denying it, Zoe. I see you, and you see me too. We don't need to hide anything anymore. I know what you're trying to avoid, and it's eating me up as much as it is you." The air between us was thicker now, as if an invisible barrier had been broken down. I could feel Alexander's body so close to mine that I could almost hear his heartbeat mixing with mine. But at the same time, there was something stopping me from taking the next step, from allowing that tension to be consummated. He reached out, touching my arm with a gentleness that made me shudder. "I know you don't want to, but at the same time, I know you do. It's not just about what's happening here. It's about everything that has brought us to this moment." I looked at him, and it was as if the world had stopped. There were no more words between us, just the silence that carried everything that couldn't be said. I stood there, unable to move a muscle, while he stood in front of me, closer than anyone should be. "Zoe," he murmured, now so close to me that his breath mingled with mine. "I want you." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the thoughts, but all I could feel was his presence, the intensity of those words, and the warmth that spread throughout my body. I knew what he wanted, and I knew he was willing to do anything to get it. But at that moment, the choice was no longer about what he wanted. It was about what I wanted, and what I was willing to lose. I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together, but something inside me snapped. "We can't do this, Alexander," I said, my voice almost inaudible, but loaded with a firmness that surprised me. "We can't cross that line." He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the disappointment and frustration in his eyes, but also something else, something I couldn't identify. He didn't say anything straight away. He just took a step back and, with a sigh, seemed to come to terms with it. "You're right," he said, his voice low, but without the same defiant tone as before. "But I can't help feeling that we're putting off what is inevitable." I didn't know what he meant by that, but the words kept echoing in my mind as we continued our walk, now quieter, without the intense gazes that once connected us. I sensed that there was more behind each of his gestures, more than he was willing to show me, and I knew that, at any moment, the line he had mentioned would be crossed. We returned home later, but the atmosphere seemed different, as if what had happened at that moment had changed everything. I knew I couldn't keep things the way they were any longer. The tension between us could no longer be ignored. We were on the edge of a precipice, and there was no turning back. What would happen from that moment on, I didn't know. But I felt, with painful clarity, that my life would never be the same again. Night fell, and with it, silence took over the house. But inside me, the storm was yet to come. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. The house, which had once seemed like a cozy and peaceful place, was now immersed in palpable tension, as if the walls, which had always been a refuge, were now closing in around me. Every little movement, every exchange of glances with Alexander, seemed to amplify this feeling of claustrophobia. Silence was now my greatest enemy. Balthazar was still far away, which, on the one hand, gave me a sense of freedom, but at the same time, his absence made everything more difficult to control. The weight of being alone with Alexander and the weight of everything we didn't talk about became unbearable. It was a warm Friday evening when we finally felt that something was going to happen. The heat in the house made the room stuffy, and I could feel the sweat running down my back as I tried to keep my composure. I was in the hallway, heading for the kitchen, when I heard the living room door open. Alexander. I knew he was home. I also knew that he was getting ready for something that went beyond the words we had exchanged so far. He wasn't the same as before, and neither was I. Something in me had changed irreversibly. I looked over and saw Alexander's silhouette in the doorway, his face illuminated only by the soft light of the lamp. He was standing with his arms crossed, and his eyes were fixed on me. "You're tense," he said, his voice low and sure, as if he already knew exactly what was going on inside me. I realized that. It was no longer possible to hide anything from him. I could feel the frustration building up inside me, along with immense confusion. What did he want from me? What did I want from him? I didn't know anymore. I didn't know what was right and what was wrong. "I don't know what you're trying to do, Alexander," I replied, my voice breaking for a moment. "But this can't go on." He stepped forward and, in one swift movement, closed the distance between us. I couldn't react immediately. I couldn't push him away, even though something inside me was screaming at me to do so. He was too close, and the heat emanating from him seemed to consume me. "Don't lie to yourself," he said, his eyes shining with an intensity I didn't know how to face. "I know how you feel. There's no hiding it anymore, Zoe." I could feel my breathing becoming faster. My surroundings seemed to shrink, the weight of reality crushing me. I tried to take a step back, but he wouldn't let me. His hand reached out to touch my arm, gently, but with the firmness of someone who knows exactly what he wants. And he wanted something from me. Something I didn't know if I was ready to give. "I can't do that," I whispered, but my voice didn't sound as convincing as I wanted it to. "I'm married to Balthazar. I love Balthazar." The words came out of my mouth like a cry for help, a desperate attempt to return to what was familiar, what still felt right. But the words were no longer convincing me. I knew deep down that there was something wrong with me. Something that was drawing me to him, to Alexander, in a way that I couldn't control. He smiled softly, but full of silent understanding. "Zoe, make no mistake. You want me as much as I want you. I know that, and you know it too." There was something in his eyes that made me feel like I was being stripped naked, not physically, but emotionally. He saw me in a way that I didn't want to be seen. He understood my fears, my weaknesses, and used that to disarm me. He was breaking down all the defenses I had built up, and I didn't know how to stop him. "You don't understand," I tried to say, but my voice sounded almost flat. "I can't do that. I'm married to Balthazar. He trusts me." "He's far away," Alexander interrupted, his voice cold now, almost dismissive. "He's not here, Zoe, and you're here with me right now. What you feel for me is real, just as much as what he feels for you." I could no longer deny the obvious. The desire, the longing I had for him, was as real as the air I breathed. I no longer knew what to do with it. I was torn between two worlds, between two contradictory desires, and the confusion was consuming me. He moved even closer, and I could feel the warmth of his body against mine. His closeness made my heart race even faster, and I felt a growing pressure in my chest. He was touching me, gently, but so full of meaning that I could hardly breathe. "Zoe, I want you," he said, and his voice was soft but charged with an urgency that I didn't know how to ignore. "I know you want me too," I didn't know what else to do. I was so lost in my own feelings that any decision seemed impossible. I felt such a strong attraction to him that I was afraid, but at the same time, the guilt that I was pulling away from Balthazar was eating away at me. I was at breaking point. I could no longer keep my distance. I could no longer deny what was happening. Alexander was right. I felt what he felt. There was no hiding it, no fighting the attraction that consumed us. With an almost involuntary movement, I took a step towards him, and that was enough. The connection between us, which had become so dense, fell apart in a second. His mouth found mine, and in a single gesture, all the control I had over myself fell away. I no longer knew who I was trying to fool. It was a kiss full of all the emotions I had been repressing. Desire, guilt, anguish, all mixed up in a single movement. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless, and I saw a silent satisfaction in his eyes, as if he knew he had won me over in a way I could no longer deny. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist," he said, with a satisfied but not arrogant smile. "I knew that at some point, you would give in." I looked at him, not knowing what to think or what to say. What happened there was no longer about love or desire. It was about something much deeper, an irresistible force that I didn't know how to control. I was at the mercy of my own feelings and desires, and I no longer knew how to turn back. That night, while the house was silent, we paid attention to our feelings. And deep down, a part of me knew that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated and dangerous. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't hide anymore. It's not over yet. Click on the cards and continue with us.